I hope you notice my pink fingernail, folks. Hey, they're a little a few seats down here, and you can, if you want to, anyone wants to sit down in this section, you're welcome to do it. I'm reminded, I'm a little surprised at the size of the crowd, if only because yesterday and the day before, when I asked some of my students, how many of you intend to vote, about half the students in the class said that they were voting, and about half said that they were not. I guess this is the half that was voting. I'm also reminded of something that President Nixon said when the POWs following the Vietnam War came to a White House reception. He said, "I love having a captive audience." So I got one other problem here. I'm at that age. John McCain and I are just about the same age. So I have bifocals here, and this podium is such that it's a little too far down for the bifocals and not quite far enough up, so I don't have to wear bifocals. So I have a script, and I will read it this way, and I'll just be holding this. I was originally going to talk about the election. The more I didn't hear anyone talking about the crash, the financial crisis, I decided to at least add that. And as I've developed this thing over the last week or so, the crash has become kind of more of my comment, and the election a little bit less so, although I'm certainly going to be dealing with both. In 1936, the pollsters were so sure that presidential candidate Alf Landon would defeat Franklin Roosevelt that they stopped polling about 6 weeks before the election. In 1948, we saw a repeat of this when the pollster decided that Thomas Dewey had defeated Harry Truman even before a single voter had cast his ballot, or her ballot. In 1968, Nixon was ahead of Democrat Hubert Humphrey by nearly 10 percentage points just 2 weeks before the election. In fact, Nixon would win the election by just 1 percentage point. In 2004, as many of you remember, most of the experts had concluded by the end of the campaign that Kerry would defeat Bush by about 3 to 4 points. Well, I think that Kerry is probably still wondering why so many of his supporters stopped off for a beer and never left the saloons. Last night, a former CNN correspondent right here talked to us about the election. But I find it a bit surreal that we've not yet had at AU this season a public talk about the context in which the election is being held, namely the financial crash of 2008, a crash that might lead to what one PBS commentator recently called, and I quote, "the most dangerous crisis this country has experienced since the American Revolution." Not the Civil War, not the Great Depression, since the American Revolution. It would be nice to dismiss this kind of comment as hyperbole, as overstatement. But we can't do that. The guy who made the comment is a fellow named Nassim Taleb, a highly respected economist and also a random theorist. And he addressed, as early as 2006, those financial institutions that are allegedly, quote, too big to fail. He wrote that, "When I look at its risks, it seems to be sitting on a barrel of dynamite." And there are other top-notch economists who agree with him, including Stephen Roach, who's the head of Morgan Stanley Asia, and Bill Gross, the most highly respected bond expert in this country. A financial tsunami, warned Gross in August, just weeks before you-know-what hit our economic fan. Which is why I am astounded that the coming election hasn't been even more directly affected by the crisis. Ever since the New Hampshire primary, when John McCain revived his sagging campaign and proved to be our comeback grandpa, I've predicted that he'd win this election. In spite of Bush's sinkhole popularity, I thought McCain had enough independence and integrity to ride his white horse into the White House. Yet, and I especially remind my main critics, Tom Peterson and Emrys Westacott, I had always added that one thing could sink him, and that was the possibility of a genuine economic crisis. And of course, here we are. Though it's worth noting that more and more political analysts now agree that Pennsylvania, with its huge block of electoral votes, is still in play. And that as goes Pennsylvania, so goes Ohio, where McCain apparently leads by about 1%. And remember, it was Ohio that gave Bush the election in 2004. Now, I want to retreat for a moment back to 1948. By this week, that is the week before the election, Thomas Dewey, the Republican candidate, who polls predicted would win easily, had already ended his campaign. And scrappy Harry Truman, he was still knocking on farmhouse doors in central Kansas. Fortunately for Harry, he hadn't had to worry about things like Iraq or Afghanistan or a very loose-lipped vice presidential candidate like Joe Biden. This year is different. John McCain has made foreign affairs an important element of the campaign. And while the Iraq war is unpopular, his support for the surge is winning him points in important states, especially states with military bases. And of course, one observer reminds us, that McCain had also supported the surge that sent General Custer to Little Bighorn. So we better not ignore our political or our economic history. But first, a note about my own history. Back in 1986, I predicted this crash. And while my colleagues say that if I wait long enough, all my dumb predictions will come true, what's disconcerting is that the current crash occurred for reasons that I identified over 20 years ago. True, I had never heard at that time of subprime loans, or credit default swaps, or derivatives. But I really did get some things right. In other words, today's crisis was predictable. And I say this because it was predicted by a lot of other people, a hell of a lot more recently, and a lot smarter than I am. Warren Buffett, the savviest investor in this country, if not the world, called financial derivatives, which have hugely contributed to this crisis, weapons of mass destruction. George Soros, another smart billionaire, refuses to trade in derivatives because he says we can't really understand them. Felix Royatan, a guy who was not just smart but wise. He kind of was the fellow who led New York City out of bankruptcy back in the 1970s. He calls derivatives hydrogen bombs. Yeah, this crash was predictable. It was also bipartisan. McCain, though certainly not as much as George Bush, shoulders some responsibility by foolishly opposing bank regulation. But so too does Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and a few other Democrats who would like to deflect the spotlight from their own role. The current crisis is a product of a lot of things that most students at this university do not understand. These things include subprime mortgages promoted to people who have dreadful credit ratings. They include $55 trillion, imagine that, $55 trillion in credit default swaps that are really pretend insurance, kind of fake insurance against bad investments. They include out-of-control hedge funds that supposedly allow investors to protect their losses by switching investments to safer ground. Then there's collateralized debt that supposedly anchors loans in collateral that turned out to have no value of its own. And securitized mortgages that bundle together regular mortgages that will never be paid. But most important of all are those derivatives that I mentioned a minute ago. Derivatives are financial instruments whose value is derived, that's where it gets its name, whose value is derived from other assets. Some of those assets are hard, like real estate, although real estate can lose value. Some of those assets are soft, like the value of bonds. In 1988, derivatives were of negligible value in this country. By 2002, they were valued at $107 trillion. By this past summer, $531 trillion. Now do you understand why the $700 billion bailout plan of a few weeks ago is just, in a sense, a drop in the bucket? And these derivatives are also related to something called leverage, big-time leverage. And in case you don't know what leverage is, it's simply investing borrowed money to make more money. That's what leverage is. So please believe me when I say that this crisis is not a crisis of confidence. I'm sick and tired of hearing politicians, including both McCain and Obama, use that phrase. Of course confidence has dropped into the toilet. That's because there should be a crisis of confidence. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, FDR said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He was wrong. They had lots of things to fear back then. One was the disappearance of our ability to purchase foreign goods because of a colossally short-sighted tariff policy. That's a tax on foreign goods. Another was a drop of 40% in American industrial production by 1932. A third was the collapse of over 7,000 banks. Well, our economy has changed since the 1930s. We have an economy dominated not by the family farms of Jefferson's era or by the corporations of FDR, but rather by the huge financial institutions. A British economist named John Hobson said many years ago, almost a century ago, that what Britain was moving into, and certainly what we have today, should be called finance capitalism. Finance, as in huge financial institutions that send perhaps 10 to 20 billion dollars, I'm sorry, 10 to 20 trillion dollars zipping around the globe electronically every single day. I repeat, I'm talking about trillions upon trillions of dollars being exchanged daily via banks that have un-American names like Credit Suisse, that's Switzerland, and HSBC, that's Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Royal Bank of Scotland, and of course a few American banks that until recently competed on equal terms. Let me put it differently. Number one, our economy has been internationalized. Number two, our economy is not anchored on anything, in anything. Once upon a time, it was anchored in agriculture, later in industry. No longer. And it's not anchored because it's floating. And what it's floating on is debt. Debt issued by these banks. That debt includes homeowner mortgage debt. It includes credit card debt. You know, this is yesterday's New York Times. The lead article here in yesterday's Times, consumers feel the next crisis. It's credit cards. There's about $3 trillion in credit card debt in this country. And when that starts to go under, you know, the stock market's going back down. Okay? It includes, it floats on municipal debt and on state debt. Our own state of New York is going to have about a $20 billion deficit this next year. I'm hardly finished. It floats on corporate debt, reaching over $1 trillion. We call that debt corporate paper to camouflage what it really is. And then, of course, there's the nearly $10 trillion, yeah, that T again, $10 trillion of national debt. But even that figure is deceiving, for you need to add to that $10 trillion the degree to which our Social Security Trust Fund needs an injection of capital, probably up to about $11 trillion over the next 75 years if the Social Security system is to remain solvent, and much the same, I might add, for the Medicare debt. And because I like to play historian, I want you to remember Ronald Reagan. Reagan is a demigod to our current crop of conservative politicians, many of whom understand real conservatism as well as most of us understand things like credit default swaps. In the name of smaller government, President Reagan, over the short span of 8 years, increased our debt, our national debt, by more than all the other presidents in American history combined. Reagan's muscular conservatism was built on debt, which is one reason why this apostle of small government left us with the largest federal government in American history, as measured certainly in money spent and in employees. Unless the Reagan era to you students seems like ancient history, our current president has again doubled the amount of debt of all previous presidents together, from $5 trillion to over $10 trillion today. We have had a Roman orgy of spending in this country. And let's not forget, to remain solvent, we have to address these debts. The way we've addressed them is to borrow money to pay off what we earlier borrowed. That's called a pyramid scheme, borrowing to pay off what you earlier borrowed. No wonder the system is unstable. Combined with what we usually describe as deregulation, a noun that warms every conservative's heart, it leads almost inevitably to, to today. Okay? And I think it's important to remember, too, if governments don't regulate, then we must rely on what those business conservatives call self-regulation, which even a third grader knows is an oxymoron. Self-regulation means no regulation at all. A few smart people recognized that we were digging ourselves into a deep hole. Paul Volcker, a Republican and the best chairman of the Federal Reserve System that we've ever had in this country, and not so incidentally, an advisor to, of all people, Obama this year, said in 2005, financial circumstances are as dangerous and intractable as any that I can remember. James Madoff and Andrew Harless wrote a book called The Indebted Society. They wrote that, among other things, debt, directly or indirectly, has decayed the very soul of America. William Wellman wrote a book called The Judas Economy. Historically, he said, the financialization of society has always been a symbol that a nation's economic position has entered a phase of deterioration. And I want you to remember that term, financialization. So perhaps I ought to say something about why we don't regulate. Part Although only part of the reason is that conservatives who have demonized government don't want us to regulate. As Reagan often said, let's get government off our backs. Some conservatives don't like regulation because of their free market philosophy. Others oppose regulation for more selfish reasons. By the late 70s, many Americans, including Democrats like Jimmy Carter, were already flirting with deregulation. In 1978, the Supreme Court in the Marquette decision freed credit card companies like Citibank and MBNA from interest rate restrictions, which I should add is why some of you in this room probably are paying interest of up to 30% annually on your credit cards. 2 years later, bank interest rates were deregulated by President Carter. In 1984, Congress passed the Bank Holding Company Act, which rolled back New Deal restrictions on banks. Among other things, the new law allowed banks to buy entire companies that had absolutely nothing to do with investment, nothing to do with banking. Some of these companies did just fine. Others of these companies became financial basket cases. One of John McCain's chief economic advisors, former Texas Senator Phil Gramm, led the charge against regulation of financial institutions while he was still in Congress. He even got his wife appointed to one of the chief regulatory bodies where she promptly tried to undermine its work. The deregulation beer blast continued under Bill Clinton. In bed with a Republican Congress when he wasn't in bed with a well-known White House intern, Clinton signed in 1999 the Financial Services Modernization Act, which, as Republican strategist Kevin Phillips puts it, further gutted regulation. For instance, this act fragmented regulatory authority over individual banks so that each function of a bank, say, giving out loans or mortgages or savings accounts, each of these functions was going to be regulated by a different agency in Washington. So there was no single agent that could, provide overall supervision of the entire bank or of the entire banking system. And therefore, it fatally undermined this bill, the effectiveness of our regulatory authority. A former banking official who promoted the measure back then has said more recently he had no idea that we were creating a Frankenstein. By year 2000, financial sector profits, which include banks and brokerages and insurance companies and real estate companies, had leapt ahead of manufacturing by 33% as a share of our national wealth. By 2004, 40% of all profits of American corporations went to financial institutions like the Bank of America and Goldman Sachs and so forth. Finance had become the largest single sector of our economy, constructed on a foundation of sand. Moreover, let's not forget the bipartisan angle to debt addiction. As Republicans during the 80s came to see tax cuts as more attractive than conventional sex, seducing themselves with terms like supply-side economics and the infamous Laffer curve that purportedly proved that the government could increase tax revenues by lowering taxes, they became not the traditional Republican Party of balanced budgets, but the modern Republican Party of bloated budgets. And they got away with this for two reasons. Because most Americans, that's us, are economically ignorant, and because increasing debt gave all of us a short-term fix. It felt good. We borrowed and borrowed. We borrowed and borrowed. And others, like the Japanese and the Chinese, oddly remained willing to lend to us. And they lent to us because we either provided them things that they needed, like military aid, or we bought their cheap consumer goods and put them into and replaced American goods in stores like Walmart's and Abercrombie and so forth. What Papa George Bush had described as voodoo economics when he ran for president in 1980, that became national policy within less than 5 years. Embraced not only by Reagan, but by Papa Bush himself when he then became president in 1989. Clinton followed the same script during the 1990s, as did the son of Papa Bush more recently. And once on a roll, we stayed on a roll. Bubbles burst, of course. But even the collapse of the technology bubble in 2001 did not smarten us up about our housing bubble and about the more general stock market bubble. So My point is that, we love this. And by the way, when the good folks at TIA tell us, on the faculty or on the staff that we can expect our 7 or 8 or 9 or 10% increase to our retirements every year, it's all part of exactly the same thing. And we believe them, okay? We believe them. We are the suckers being bored every minute. Peter Peterson, Nixon's former Commerce Secretary, in his superb but unsettling book called Running on Empty, which came out, I might add, in 2004, saw the handwriting on the wall. So do Republican strategist Kevin Phillips, whose brilliant American Theocracy, published in 2006, is the basis for some of what I'm saying today. Unfortunately, these books languished on bookshelves. Well, books with titles like Dow 36,000, okay, and another book called Why the Real Estate Boom Will Not Bust, while these books became bestsellers. And I might add that the author of Dow 36,000, Ken Hazlitt, one of the two authors, happens to be right now one of McCain's 2 chief economic advisors. And then there's Alan Greenspan. Greenspan served as chairman of our Federal Reserve System for 18 long years and is, in my humble opinion, the most overrated public official since Herbert Hoover. Greenspan led us on a fool's errand toward lower interest rates and lower taxes, which of course sped up our debt, while the huge resources of the investment community poured big bucks into buying congressional and White House support for their pet projects. Along with his sidekick, Clinton's Treasury Secretary Richard Rubin, Greenspan scuttled efforts to regulate this out-of-control financial system. In 1992, Congressman Ed Markey from Massachusetts tried to regulate the growing derivative trade that I discussed before. Greenspan helped persuade Congress to defeat Markey's bill. In 1997, Brooksley Born, the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, sought to resurrect Markey's plan. Same fate as the investment community, encouraged by both Greenspan and Rubin, warned that regulation would lead to a crisis, as if the lack of regulation somehow wouldn't lead to a crisis. As I said before, this is a bipartisan effort. I might add one more thing about Greenspan. In fairness to Greenspan, when he testified before Congress just last week, he admitted that he made some serious errors, some serious mistakes. I ask you, when was the last time that you heard someone from Washington, a high official in Washington, admit to mistakes? In any case, I want to give you a little bit more history. For most of the 20th century, we were the most important manufacturing country on Earth. On the day that one of our bombs obliterated Hiroshima, nearly 44% of all jobs in New York City were factory jobs. By year 2000, factory jobs in the Big Apple had fallen to less than 4%. Banks, not manufacturing or technology companies, had become the most highly capitalized sector of the economy. When I use the word capitalized, I simply mean they had become the richest sector of our economy. And as I've noted earlier, banks do what banks do. They made loans in this increasingly unregulated environment. And so, with more and more loans being issued to poor and poor credit risks at ever higher interest rates, we were treated by 2004 to a business or individual declaring bankruptcy every 15 seconds. And 2004 was a good year. Today we see bankruptcies occurring about once every 9 seconds. And for you math majors, if I get my math correct here, it's about 4,500 bankruptcies every month. This could be worse next year, regardless of who wins the election. Hey, I've not even mentioned Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. They provide half the mortgages in this country. And since 1994, they have effectively become private corporations, free to make campaign contributions to our struggling politicians. Over $106,000 in just 4 years went to an aspiring freshman senator named Barack Obama from Illinois. On an annually adjusted basis, that even beat out what Fannie Mae gave to Senate Banking Committee member and now chairman of that banking committee, Christopher Dodd of Connecticut, who got a total of $133,000 over 14 years. And by the way, these figures do not include the monies given to these candidates individually by officers and by directors of these corporations. Fannie Mae, which had about $1 on hand for every $100 that it issued in loans, and I cannot emphasize how irresponsible those numbers I've just given you are. Okay, that means, in other words, that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were way undercapitalized. They didn't begin to have enough money to meet any possible losses, and of course we discovered what that means this year. In any case, they did something that was very, very clever. Fannie Mae set up a foundation, gifting money to arts associations and libraries in 40 of our 50 states, so that Fannie and Freddie became politically invulnerable. No wonder they were immune to congressional oversight. Congressmen and senators who should have protected us instead protected these financial giants who were, in fact, about to screw us. Politicians always say that they are not influenced by the gifts that they receive from individuals or corporations. Folks, anyone who believes that politicians aren't influenced by those campaign contributions deserves Sarah Palin as your vice president. And so these mortgage giants got a free ride. And not just the corporations, but the thieves who ran them, such as Clinton's ex-chief of staff, Franklin Raines, who legally raked in over $90 million as chief of Fannie Mae, and officials like Chris Dodd and Raines, who both received preferential loans from mortgage companies and so forth. Do you know who didn't get preferential treatment? John McCain didn't, okay? Not on a single one of his 8 or 9 homes. In any case, Fannie and Freddie were generous to politicians in both parties. When the Republicans controlled Congress until 2006, they got the lion's share of campaign contributions from these companies. Since 2006, the Democrats have gotten more contributions. One sleazy Republican, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, after 2 of his colleagues tried to reform this corrupt system, defended these legal bribes by arguing that they are covered by the free speech clause of the First Amendment of our Constitution. And let's give those 2 colleagues some credit. Let's applaud Wisconsin's Russ Feingold and Arizona's John McCain for their efforts. These 2 senators are among only 7 in the entire Senate to renounce the system of earmarks, where our tax dollars are used to buy our votes by funding pet projects in home districts. Admittedly, some of these projects are worthy, like new libraries. Many of them, like the Bridge to Nowhere, are certainly anything but, how shall I put, worthy. Anything but worthy. As a matter of fact, the sponsor of the Bridge to Nowhere, Senator Ted Stevens from Alaska, was just indicted on 7 felony counts this very week. His office, by the way, his senatorial office, is in a Washington sewer. Now, I want to note 2 more economic developments before I really get back to politics here. I've used 2 terms today that help to define the shape of the new economy: financialization and internationalization. The latter is just a synonym for globalization. We are no longer masters of our own economic fate. We are increasingly dependent on others to buy some of the few goods that we continue to manufacture. And most of what we buy comes from foreign countries. 38% of our durable goods come from foreign countries. 50% of our automobiles. 71% of the electronic products that we buy. 99% of everything that we wear on our feet. Last year, nearly 90% of all of the new issues of Treasury bonds were bought abroad, mostly by Japanese and Chinese banks, but certainly by others as well. To dramatize our dependence on foreign economies, just think about the following. Most of our recent space satellites, private space satellites, were sent up into space on foreign rockets. And do I have to remind you that I've hardly said a word about oil? Once upon a time, we were the world's largest oil producer. Today, we import twice as much as we drill at home. In fact, we import more than twice as much oil as does the very next largest oil importer, which happens to be China. In the year when the Republicans have made drill, baby, drill into a campaign slogan, sort of a meaningless slogan, since it's really not very much oil that we're going to be drilling any longer. And not only that, but it's going to take about 10 to 15 years to put this oil online. It's a year when both candidates are telling us that we need to drive down the price of oil. Okay, telling us what they should be telling us is that we ought to slap a $3 tax per gallon on oil. That will discourage oil consumption. If we tax oil, we can use the revenue to subsidize alternative energy production. So that, and here I will give Obama credit, so that we need not have to borrow from the Asians to finance our huge oil-related deficit. Few of these issues have been part of what many of us believe to be the most important presidential campaign in recent history. Oh, sure, there has been attention to oil drilling, and Obama has criticized government subsidies to oil corporations. By the way, oil corporations get around $13 billion a year in subsidies. Alternative energy corporations get about $2 to $3 billion a year, okay, in governmental subsidies. In either case, McCain, who refuses to sponsor earmarks, to no one's surprise, reminds us about Obama's support for Fannie Mae and some of those other special interests. But in fact, the most important way that economic issues have become part of the campaign relates to tax cuts and tax increases. McCain announces that he will extend all of Bush's 2001 tax cuts and will even sponsor new ones, including cutting the capital gains tax by 50%. Now, a capital gains tax is a tax on investments like stocks or like real estate that you buy at one price and then you sell eventually at a higher price, and you're taxed on the difference there. He also promotes a sharp reduction in corporate and estate taxes. Obama, on the other hand, announces that he will cut taxes on 95% of us while increasing taxes only on the wealthiest 5%. That's not exactly a risky suggestion, since most wealthy Americans already vote Republican. Now, why do I mention this? Because I believe that the positions of both candidates are irresponsible. Of course we all want to pay lower taxes, especially when gas prices have risen, and many Americans are losing their jobs. Unemployment was 6.1% last month. By next summer, we expect it to be somewhere between 8 and 10%. I'll even concede that it makes sense to temporarily cut taxes as part of a financial stimulus plan. But neither Obama nor McCain are talking about a temporary cut. Like Bush 8 years ago, they are trying to buy our votes. They are pandering to us. When we have a national debt of nearly $10 trillion and when we have a looming $750 billion annual deficit, and when a tax stimulus that both parties now support threatens to increase those numbers, permanent tax cuts are simply nuts. So I repeat something that I alluded to earlier. Our prosperity floats on debt. It is fake. We are only now beginning to pay the price for this irresponsibility, and we are too scared and too greedy and too ideological to understand fully the danger that we face. Instead of educating ourselves, and by the way, you might ask yourselves, how many students at Alfred University are majoring in economics? How many courses have students in this auditorium taken in the field of economics? Instead of educating ourselves, we retreat into the fantasy world of news broadcasts that devote more time to Sarah Palin's $150,000 wardrobe than to our Federal Reserve policy. Every student in this university knows the channel that carries Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. But few of our students ever watch our best TV news carried by our two non-commercial channels, PBS and C-SPAN. Hey folks, what I'm saying is that we are part of the problem. I like John McCain. I've always liked John McCain. I like his independence. He was among the very few Republicans to oppose Bush's tax cuts, to promote a reasonable immigration bill, and to condemn torture, to really condemn torture, in and outside of military prisons. Perhaps that is the most under-discussed issue of this campaign. McCain co-sponsored campaign finance reform. He opposed the constitutional amendment to ban abortion, and he opposed drilling for oil in one of our national treasures, the Arctic Wildlife Preserve. He even admitted, unlike most other members of his party, that climate change was not only real, but substantially man-made. Did that make him a maverick? I think the answer is yes. Yeah, he supported Bush most of the time, but I think that I think it works. But that's not the John McCain who's running for president. I think Mr. McCain, if he loses the election, lost it on September 24th, when he announced that he would suspend his campaign and flew to Washington to spearhead the salvation of our investment banking system. That was his Black Tuesday. Lehman Brothers, remember, and Merrill Lynch had just collapsed, while Covia Bank and Washington Mutual were on the brink. Two things happened. Number one, McCain did not really suspend his campaign. Number two, he failed to get Congress to pass the bailout bill that he had promoted. Worse, when a bailout bill was passed, it contained tons of pork, making him look ineffective and hypocritical. He never recovered from this. To make matters worse, he reversed course in respect to virtually all the elements of his maverick legacy. He announced opposition to his own immigration bill. He supported a measure that allows CIA torture of prisoners. He repudiated his earlier opposition to Bush's tax cuts. He became rigidly pro-life. And then there's oil. While he has not called for drilling in the wildlife preserve, and give him credit for that, he has said that one of the reasons he selected Sarah Palin was because she's an expert. Yeah, I'm not kidding. That she's an expert about energy policy. The issue of honesty is central here. When questioned about two of his dishonest campaign ads, including one which accused Obama of promoting the teaching of sex ed to kindergartners, McCain flatly defended the ads as true, placing himself into the unenviable position of lying about his lying. Here's a candidate who built his career on themes of trust and integrity. And by the way, his book, Faith of Our Fathers, is definitely worth reading. In many ways, it's a very inspiring book. Here's a candidate, as I said, who built his career on themes of trust and integrity. It's an old story. The ends justify the means. A sad development for a candidate who had roundly denounced similar tactics after they had destroyed his own candidacy for president during the Republican primaries of the year 2000. To complicate matters, yeah, there's his vice presidential candidate. Now look, I love Tina Fey. Folks, we're just getting to know Sarah Palin, who may run for president in 2012. She's a nice enough lady who has plenty of spunk and energy. What she lacks is knowledge, and more importantly, respect. Respect, that is, for America, for the real America. Not what she calls the real America, but in fact, the real America. An America that contains immigrants and cities and universities and racial minorities. When she claims that the only real Americans are from small towns like Alfred, New York, I guess, she is repudiating McCain's own theme of unity, which he articulated, I thought, beautifully in his acceptance speech in St. Paul during the convention. When she damns Obama for palling around with terrorists, the real story is not former terrorist William Ayers. The real story is that she's impugning Obama's loyalty. Goodbye to the idea of the loyal opposition. This is playing with fire, and all her cutesy you betches and gosh derns cannot camouflage the McCarthyite fringe of her campaign. And I think that McCain also has something to answer for when people do yell out when the name Obama is mentioned at McCain rallies, kill him, and so forth. McCain has certainly not been as, or has, how shall I put it, as forthcoming as he should have. Will the issue of race allow the Republicans to salvage this election? Maybe. The conventional wisdom is that we are in a post-racial society and that Obama is its emblem. There's something to this. For instance, when I was a college student, no self-respecting white kid would wear a T-shirt with a picture of a black person on it. Those were the days when not a single black actor appeared in a TV commercial. And don't say that was because, TV hadn't yet been invented back then. Michael Jordan helped to change all that. Today, young people are, for the most part, much less color conscious than we were. But I was at a political meeting recently, right here in Allegheny County, where a fellow said that his mechanic, a Democrat in Wellsville, told him that he'd never vote for a black candidate for president. A recent poll indicated that 1/3 of all people questioned said that they know someone who wouldn't vote for Obama because of his race. How many of those who knew, quote, other people, end quote, were really describing themselves? There's no way of knowing. Of one thing I am sure, that the subject of voter preference and race is a good deal more complex than we usually think. There are other things, too, that are unsettling, including the fact that we may spend $4 billion this campaign season electing candidates at all levels at a moment when we are flirting with national bankruptcy. Since 97% of all elections are won by the candidate with more money, I took that 97% out of thin air. You know that all statistics are lies. That means that Obama should stroll right into the White House. How weird. A year when the Democrats have outclassed the Republicans when it comes to raising money. The first thing that happens when you walk into an Obama campaign office is that they x-ray your wallet. It's also worth noting that Obama has done especially well with an important demographic group. They're called voters. And Obama has one other thing going for him. McCain has been reduced to complaining about the way his opponents have been using age as an issue. Now again, I'm McCain's age, or almost, so I take this a little bit sensitively. A few days ago, a little girl told him that she thought he was great. He replied that that was wonderful because his opponents were whispering that he was too old to be president, that he wouldn't be able to remember the names of foreign leaders or even the names of members of his own cabinet. He promised to prove them wrong. Good, said the little girl. And then McCain said, and she's about 8 years old, now tell me, young lady, what is your name? The kid looked a little confused. She said, it's me, Grandpa. In fact, the reason I'll vote for McCain is that I don't want to put Tina Fey out of work. Jay Leno mentioned that a recent poll showed that 91.1% of all voters say that they'd rather see Palin in a bikini than Pam Anderson. But that 99% say they'd rather see Pamela Anderson as vice president. Nor does Obama get a free pass from the comics. Jesse Jackson yesterday reached out to Obama, and Obama said, keep your hands where I can see them. And with that stolen joke, I'll end and I'll thank you for your patience. And thank Emrys Westacott and Bill DeBrell and the Division of Human Studies for continuing to organize Bergman Forums. And now I will invite questions. My only request is that, especially given the size of the crowd, if you ask a question, especially from the front of the room, please do so loud enough so people in the back can hear. Thank you very much.